what seems to have been agreed to is, again, starting this negotiating process for 60 days. It effectively kicks down the nuclear issue, kicks the can of the nuclear issue down the road, and says vaguely Iran commits not to acquire a nuclear weapon, which Iran is still a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it should not be acquiring a nuclear weapon. It's great that it's reiterating that, but that is by itself not particularly valuable. And that they're going to discuss what happens with the highly enriched uranium stock, of which Iran has several hundred kilograms, and that it could use for nuclear weapons. So it kind of doesn't address the issue of what is going to happen with that. It doesn't talk about what verification might look like in Iran. So what happens with their National Atomic Energy Agency and its ability to regain what's called continuity of knowledge to be able to verify that Iran's nuclear program is indeed peaceful. It doesn't tell us what the sequencing of events is going to look like. That's a big question, right? It talks about giving Iran significant sanctions relief, but it doesn't really talk about what that sequencing is going to look like.
Hello, welcome to Oasis. I'm your host, Dave DeRoche, Senior Fellow at the Gulf International Forum. Oasis is a podcast dedicated to contemporary issues in the Middle East, not necessarily focusing on security, but anything of interest really to the Gulf International Forum. Today, I'm proud to introduce in our first virtual interview a person that is one of the focal points of both analysis and inadvertently controversy, I think, when you look at the United States' reaction to the Gulf. Ariane Tabatabai has a fascinating background. She was a double major at Stony Brook and graduated with distinction, highest distinction. She attained her doctorate in the King's College London Department of Defense Studies. She's noted for her work at the State Department as a Naval Reserve officer during the Joe Biden administration, at the Office of Secretary of Defense in various capacities, most notably in my old home, Special Operations Directorate, and is currently the Vice President of Research at the Global Affairs Conference of Chicago. As a prominent and a member of the Iranian diaspora that focus on Iranian affairs, she has been drawn into some of the conflict and contrast there, but she's also been thrust into the spotlight for her outstanding analysis and her level of knowledge in a country that, quite frankly, American analysts are schizophrenic about, and I find that Iranian analysts are schizophrenic about. So I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of confusion, and we look forward to having her. Dr. Tabatabai, welcome to the Oasis.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. It's a pleasure.
All right. We always like to start off a little bit talking about your background because one of our target audiences are young people and they want to know how they get there. So can we start off? I mean, I don't know a whole lot about New York. I went to university there, but I was basically a prisoner. And Stony Brook, for me, is associated with higher sciences and mathematics. And you had an interesting double major, international relations, which I suppose one would expect, but also you did film and cultural studies. Can we talk about the latter, the film and cultural studies? What did you do on that, and how did that affect your ongoing work?
You can probably tell I'm a big film buff from the posters I have behind me. Yeah, so I actually went to school at Stony Brook, which was a great experience. I'm a big fan of public universities, underappreciated public good. To become a political science major, which I did become a political science major, but along the way, I was always a film buff, but I discovered cinema and cultural studies. We had some fantastic professors, and that put me on track to what I thought was going to be a journey toward film school. And I was really into cinematography. I did internships in cinematography when I was in college. And so I was really hoping to go down that path. And then I found myself in Iran in 2009. It would be, I didn't know it at the time, one of the last times I would ever go there.
Hmm.
And as your listeners will know, in 2009, a lot of things were happening. Among them was the Green Movement. And I ended up participating in some of the protests of 2009. And, I saw some of my friends who were smarter than I was, who probably had brilliant lives ahead of them if they were giving the opportunities, end up in jail. Some of them, their lives altered for good. And it really shook me, and it kind of put me on a different trajectory. And I decided that I was maybe not going to do the whole film thing, and I was
Hmm.
going to do the political science thing and get into policy and try to kind of make sense of what was going on in the region, and kind of try to think about how to pay it forward. So that's how I ended up coming into this space, which is a bit of a roundabout way, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so the poster of Bout de Souffle, the Breathless, and I think about the female lead in that, Jean Seberg, kind of had a sort of similar thing. She was noted for that role and for playing Joan of Arc, which is always inherently political in a French context. I mean, Joan of Arc is currently the adopted mascot of the various right-wing French parties. But then later on, she was a political activist, active with the Black Panther movement, surveyed by the FBI for her movements overseas. So is it the Nouvelle Vague that you're into, or what would you say is your prime interest?
I don't discriminate. I love all movies. Not all movies. That's a lie.
I was thinking Three Stooges.
Yeah, I don't love. I'm not a horror movie fan, but
Hmm.
I do love a lot of cinema history. I love the golden age of Hollywood. I do love the Nouvelle Vague, as you said. There was this kind of golden age also of Hong Kong cinema,
Hmm.
that was really fantastic. In the Mood for Love, which is the other
Hmm.
picture you see behind me,
Hmm.
really kind of peak of that era, and it's sad to actually see what has become of what was a very thriving art scene and cinema scene there. So yeah, I love a lot of different movies. Probably not as much of a rom-com fan, and not as much of
Hmm.
a horror movie fan.
Yeah. Can I ask you? The Iranian diaspora lost a prominent figure in the arts, Marjane Satrapi. This is a little bit of a divergence, but you are what you are, and could you share your thoughts on her and her legacy or impact?
Yeah, something folks don't necessarily know about me. I actually grew up in France,
Hmm.
and for a lot of it, and comic books and graphic novels
Mm.
are a huge cultural thing in France. So I grew up on all of those things. And when her first comic book, the really the prominent one that put her on the radar for many, Persepolis, came out,
Hmm.
obviously it kind of tied to interests of mine, my family background, and later on my kind of interest in the history and the politics of the country. But also graphic novels, and then later on, there was the movie
Hmm.
adaptation of it as well, which is just beautiful. I think it is a really wonderful way of explaining a complex situation and personalizing it, and what graphic novels and movies do so well, right? Of
Hmm.
kind of taking very personal stories and making them into things that everyone across the globe can understand. You don't need to have lived in Iran in the 1970s. I didn't. I wasn't even born then, to understand what she's trying to communicate. And so it's both the graphic novel and the movie have always been on the kind of optional list of reading list that I've given to my
Hmm.
students for years, just because I think it does such a great job of capturing what life was like, and in some ways still is in the country.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, um, I always try to explain to young people there was a graphic novel in the '80s called Watchmen, and it basically was an immersion in the sort of nuclear angst that the earlier Greenham Common, cruise missiles, and Ronald Reagan going to lead us in it, and it's hard to explain to younger people, but it had a diptych focus and really conveyed zeitgeist of that, when everybody was reading Jonathan Shell and talking about, Helen Caldecott was a graduation speaker giving the melting eyeball speech, and so go forth, graduates. So yeah, well, that's great.
Absolutely. This is another one of my favorite graphic novels, and not to hijack the whole thing, but another one that I really think folks should read is Mouse, right? Mouse is probably my favorite graphic novel of all time. It just is an incredible. I had chills reading the graphic novel, which it's basically about a bunch of animals, right? There are mice and cats and whatever, but it just does such a brilliant job of driving the story and telling you about the Holocaust through the prism of these creatures who are not human, and it's wonderful. So.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. We're going to get off of graphic novels. I'm sorry. That's a little bit of divergence. But then you went to King's College and you were in the Defense Studies department. So I take it by that you were already in government when you
War Studies department. I was not in government yet. I didn't go into government for years later. I spent, so I did my master's there, stayed for my PhD, had the benefit of really great professors and committee members and cohort. And I became interested at that point in nuclear issues. And during that time also that the JCPOA negotiations, what ended up becoming the negotiations for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action started to happen. So that kind of further drove me toward the nuclear problem set. And from there, I went on to do my pre-doc and postdoc at Harvard, and then worked kind of at various think tanks in Georgetown. And from there, went on to the RAND Corporation, and from RAND into a year later, I went into government in the Biden administration and came out of that on the other end, and here I am.
Were you a political appointee or a career person when you came in?
I was a political appointee in the Biden administration. I started at the State Department, and I went to the Department of Defense, which I feel like was more of my home than State Department was for various reasons we can come back to. You may feel similarly with your experience. And I was a Navy reservist, as you mentioned as well. So that's obviously not a political track. That's just a uniform track. But
well, it always strikes me that at the State Department, civil servants are not as valued as they are in the rest of government. Certainly not valued compared to foreign service officers. Is that a fair impression? Did you share that, or am I getting that wrong?
I think there are definitely classes in some ways at the State Department where foreign service track folks are valued, I think in some ways more so than civil servants. It should not be that way because the expertise resides across the board, right? And you need both foreign service officers and civil service officers. We can talk about where we are as a country with the state of civil service, which I think is deeply troubling. It's something, it really keeps me up at night, actually. And I think, as we get into the policy discussions, we wouldn't be where we are if we had valued that expertise and that experience, because so many of the things that have been unfolding over the past few weeks and months were things that those folks would have known, would have been able to advise on if the politicals were listening. And I think this is not just about this administration. You always need people who are willing to listen, or else that expertise and that experience is not going to matter. And some, I think, administrations and some officials are more willing to do that. But I think we should be valuing all of that, regardless of where it comes from.
So when you decided to focus on Iran, was that a personal interest, a familial interest? Language helps a lot when studying. What drew you to that? Because there's also differences there. I mean, challenges. Yeah,
I actually, funny enough, didn't really want to do work on Iran for a while. I was really interested in the kind of nuclear piece. And as, of course, the JCPOA negotiations were ongoing, I found myself doing a lot of it because you're correct, language helps. And, I think that might be changing a little bit with AI. We can talk about this later, but certainly at the time, there were really interesting pieces that you could kind of get at if you spoke the language versus people who couldn't. And so, that allowed me to kind of extract certain things that I think, others would have missed. But yeah, that's kind of ultimately I started working more on Iran just because of what was going on. And then that drew my attention. I did end up kind of coming out and doing more things at RAND. As you may know, Dave, you
Yeah.
end up doing a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
So that was my life. I did a lot of Iran, of course, because, to 2020, when I was still there was the Soleimani killing and, the tit for tat escalation that led up to it and followed from there. So, it ended up being, I keep joking that I'm much like the United States and, and U.S. policy toward the Middle East. I keep trying to pivot and I keep being dragged back in. So
It's like the mafia. Yeah. Yeah. You're Michael Corleone. They keep sucking me in.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, it's hard to get away from that. Okay. So let's get to the issue that everybody's looking at, the deal which grew out of the Islamabad agreement. There's been a lot of negotiation, a lot of negotiators, but we've heard things described, but we haven't seen it. And some of our narrators are not faithful narrators, I suspect. Have you seen the deal? And if not, what do you think is in it? And what are the implications of it?
So I have not, as of recording, seen the deal. As we've seen many texts and excerpts of texts floated around. Many of them, people should be aware of this, coming from Iranian state media and state sources. So take all of that with a grain of salt. As of right now, the president and the vice president keep saying what you're seeing online is not necessarily the deal. And I hope it is not the deal because, and I'll come back to this in a second, it is terrible what is being floated around as the contours of this agreement. So we don't have the final official deal publicly available. We're told that something has been signed already. There is going to be a public signing ceremony in Switzerland in a couple of days on Friday this week. And what that does is that it's supposed to kickstart this 60-day process where the United States and Iran try to actually close out a number of issues and get an actual deal. So the way I've been describing what seems to have been decided on this week is an interim deal, essentially. For folks who've been at this for a long time, they'll recall that before the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, there was the JPOA, or the Joint Plan of Action. That was that interim deal. So this is kind of akin to that, but much lighter on detail, and I'll talk about that in a second. So number one, take what you're seeing with a grain of salt. Number two, I do think it is problematic that we are a few days in and the United States has not released the deal. And what we keep hearing is don't pay attention to what's online. Like trust us, it's a good deal, without really telling us about the specifics. We should know a lot more. And it's kind of telling, and I think very much illustrates this whole process so far. Let me talk a little bit about what we do know about the deal and my concerns. This is a 14-point plan. Again, this is what's been reported on. So CNN and Bloomberg individually put out, and probably others as well, the 14 points, which they say were sent to them by U.S. officials and by folks who've been briefed on this deal in the G7. I'm going based off of this particular text and not based off of what Iranian state media has been putting out, although I think they're pretty similar. What seems to have been agreed to is, again, starting this negotiating process for 60 days. It effectively kicks down the nuclear issue, kicks the can of the nuclear issue down the road, and says, vaguely, Iran commits not to acquire a nuclear weapon, which Iran is still a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it should not be acquiring a nuclear weapon. It's great that it's reiterating that, but that is by itself not particularly valuable. And that they're going to discuss what happens with the highly enriched uranium stock, of which Iran has several hundred kilograms, and that it could use for nuclear weapons. So it kind of doesn't address the issue of what is going to happen with that. It doesn't talk about what verification might look like in Iran. So what happens with their National Atomic Energy Agency and its ability to regain what's called continuity of knowledge to be able to verify that Iran's nuclear program is indeed peaceful. It doesn't tell us what the sequencing of events is going to look like. That's a big question, right? It talks about giving Iran significant sanctions relief. significant sanctions relief, but it
Yeah.
doesn't really talk about what that sequencing is going to look like. I honestly was a little surprised that State Department and White House lawyers would sign off on this. I don't know if they have, but I don't imagine our lawyers would have been particularly happy with us if we had come back with this kind of draft
Yeah.
when I was in government and we're negotiating with Iran on nuclear issues. The other piece that is important to know is that it kind of commits Israel to doing certain things, including ceasing hostilities, right?
Yeah.
And its operations in Lebanon. Israel has been pretty open that it is not a party to this deal. It's not going to abide by it. So that leaves a giant question mark on this whole process. So there are a number of, in my mind, this deal does more to, there are more questions than we have answers. And I'm not even yet getting into the question of, it's not dealing with proxies, it's not dealing with missile activities, it's not dealing with a lot of things that critics of the JCPOA really hated about the JCPOA.
Yeah. It's interesting. By the way, so Stephen Chung, who is the acting spokesman during the maternity leave of the spokesman, said that the CNN text is not real. So for what it's worth, so we'll see. I mean, yeah, there's just so much that we don't know. But setting that aside from that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Setting that aside, in a post-deal thing, how does Iran's role, Iran's deterrence strategy look? What do you think has changed since before we had this war?
Yeah, so folks have been talking about this deal, if again, indeed it is a real deal, and if the text that we're seeing is a real text. People have been talking about this as bringing us back to the status quo ante and back in January. And I think it's actually worse than that. I think it brings us back in some ways, but it actually gives Iran, it does a few things for Iran. And I think many of these will resonate with you because of your military background as well. One is that we have now spent billions and billions of dollars, taken casualties, taken damage to our facilities throughout the Gulf, and depleted our stocks of munitions to degrade cheap Iranian capabilities that don't take that much time to develop, that don't take that much money to develop, and by the way, that they're going to recreate, they're going to develop, and they're going to probably develop even better with the amount of money that we're potentially giving to them. So, and this is not an Iran issue set problem alone, it is a broader problem, but it's really manifested itself here, which is that we're using these sophisticated, expensive capabilities to go after cheap Iranian drones and to blow up some Iranian missile sites that the RGC, again, is going to build back after this war is over. Number two, my concern is that Iran has not really been able to test its doctrine that it had been developing over the course of decades. As you well know, Dave, Iran had been planning for a closure of the Strait of Hormuz for years and years, had thought through that scenario. We had known that. We had planned for it. I think the way they closed the strait was a little more nuanced and tailored than what we had anticipated, but nonetheless, we'd known that they would do that. Now they have a precedent for the closure, and now they've tested how they might be able to implement that closure and how to minimize the costs for themselves while also getting the most leverage out of that closure. So there is also that piece. The third piece that I think is important here to highlight is that the division between the United States and Israel is becoming more palpable now than it was at the beginning of this war. The president has seemingly dropped a couple of F-bombs talking about Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think it's clear that while on an operational level, the countries seem to be on the same page, when it comes to political objectives, they're just completely on different pages here. And part of it is because of what the war has meant for the political reality of Iran, which is that, you have the administration keeps saying the Iranian regime is completely different. It's not. It's the same regime. It's the same exact institutions. Yes, there are some different people, but they're from that regime. They're not entirely new. This is not a new cast of characters who came out of, the opposition or some some different political reality. They're products of that very system. But they're worse because than their predecessors in many ways, because these are people who are even more hardline in many cases, who have even less experience with government and are less inclined to make concessions. So by basically every metric imaginable, I think that the United States military has been able to degrade Iranian capabilities on an operational level, but I think by every metric possible, essentially on a strategic level, this does not set. This doesn't move the ball forward. I think it kind of takes us a step back.
Yeah. Yeah, it's disappointing. My criticism of the Israeli military has always been that they're tactically brilliant and strategically vacuous, because it's sort of a reverse Clausewitz. We're both King's College alumni, so we can talk about Clausewitz, where the politics influences the military operations. You're just unable to get a political solution because in Israel, at least, they have coalition governments, proportional representation. And it looks like the American execution of this campaign strikes me as kind of an Israeli model, where you have tactical brilliance, and there are some Iran doesn't have an air defense network. The reports we're hearing about the covert movement of Gulf state oil indicates that we've destroyed their ability to conduct any surveillance at sea. But those are tactical successes, and the strategy, I don't know. What I take from your remarks is the strategy just isn't there. You mentioned the role. Yeah, you mentioned the. It's so nice when we can agree. you mentioned the role of Israel, and I think that this is complicating. I have spoken with a number of Iranian regime interlocutors, and I always. Part of it is analysis, and part of it is, quite frankly, just me putting the boot in, saying that Israel has abandoned Hezbollah. They've betrayed them. They ordered them into battle, and this agreement will not affect it. And I go a little further and say that Israel will probably have an attack on Hezbollah within 2 days of the signing of the MOU. Critique that argument and expand on it, if you'd be so kind.
I agree. Again, I think, Israel would probably argue that they're not party. I think they have argued that, actually. I don't need to suppose. I think they have argued that they're not party to this agreement, and that's true. And I think they've made it pretty clear through words and actions that they are not going to be operating on our timelines, and they're not going to stop doing what they're doing because there is this kind of process that the president is engaged in. By the way, the political kind of timelines are very different, right? Like, we have midterms that are around the corner. The president keeps saying, I don't care, but I think on some level he does care. I don't want to get into the business of getting into Donald Trump's head, but I assume that that is at least part of the calculation. It would be for any rational actor. And so obviously Israel is going to have its own elections, but this issue plays out very differently domestically in Israel than it does in the United States, right? For Netanyahu, he has been known as, and a lot of his political cachet comes from being a security hawk and being, very vocal on Iran, and kind of, having spent the past couple of years, ever since the October 7th attacks, really degrading Iranian and Iranian proxy capabilities throughout the region. So that, on some level, is a winning argument for him. I'm not enough of a Israel domestic politics expert to kind of dive more deeply into it, but true on the U.S. side, right? Because on the U.S. side of things, domestically, war is deeply unpopular. My organization, Council on Global Affairs, does a lot of polling. We're known for that. We've done a few polls on Iran and public sentiment on Iran, and it is deeply unpopular. It is slightly more popular with Republicans, but it's still not particularly popular. So, in an election cycle, this is not a winning issue for the president, and it's been divisive for him among his base even. And what's really fascinating is that, I think on some level, the president, whether he continues this war or he agrees to this deal, he is going to have tensions within his base,
Yeah.
because you do, as you well know, you have a number of folks in the MAGA movement congressional Republicans who have for a long time been opposed to any agreements with Iran, and they will certainly take issue with this particular agreement with Iran. So they won't like this deal, and they may not like many deals. And then you have the kind of anti-war, we just spent 20 years in kind of stupid wars, as they would say,
Yep.
the global war on terror. We need to get out of that business. We need to be focusing on issues. And the way the living is just skyrocketed. So, I think regardless, this is going to be a pretty difficult issue for the president to navigate domestically, and that is obviously going to both divide him further from Israel, to come back to that issue, but also going to shape some of his calculations, which might put him at odds with Netanyahu because of the domestic constraints.
Yeah. So you were raised in France, and now you live in the United States. For our foreign viewers, and we have a lot of them, could you explain how important the price of gasoline is to Americans? And for Americans, can you explain why it's not so important to people overseas? Because that, we before we went on air, we spoke. I was in the Bill Clinton White House, and one of the things that we knew is that every day he got briefed on the cost of gasoline in different cities around America. So, this is a way of leading into the economic arguments of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I mean, for our foreign listeners who may not know this, for many Americans, the price of gas is going to dictate a lot of things. That is, it's a vast country, which is a very obvious thing to say, but it means that for a lot of people, their primary mode of transportation is their car. And in rural areas, if you're driving trucks, you're spending a lot of money on gas these days. It's also affecting things like jet fuel. There is implications for food security. There are a number of ripple effects from this conflict that are really being felt here in people's bottom lines at home. And again, this is not the only factor. I'm not an economist, so I don't want to get too deep into this, but I don't think it's the only factor that is shaping some of the economic considerations, but it's certainly a big part of it right now. For Americans, why do other people not care as much? That is a great question for someone who is more of a renewable energy and economics professional. But I think a lot of countries have kind of started to take a step back from their reliance on cars like we have in the United States.
Yeah. It's kind of parallel, not at the same level as with another thing that foreigners have a hard time, which is our insistence on ownership of firearms. Having a car and the ability to move it around gives you a degree of independence that's not just social and economic, but there's also a political aspect to it that I think is hard for people who are not raised in the United States, or to a lesser extent, maybe Canada and the non-urban areas of Australia, to understand. It's a little interesting. So you spoke of the deal, and you spoke of some of the things that haven't been discussed. And one of the things that you've worked extensively on that was an Iranian demand that is not being discussed is the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the Gulf. Obviously, they're not raising that. I think there are a number of things that they're just required to state. But there is a valid question. What will the future posture of U.S. forces in the Gulf look like? The Gulf Arab states that host us have all been attacked, and the presence of U.S. forces was the precept for that, although I can say from experience, the Fairmont Palm in Dubai is not within U.S. government per diem. So there are no American forces there. I tried. You cannot get in there. What do you see the U.S. posture looking like in the future? What are the limiting factors and the enhancing factors for that?
Yeah, look, this is a U.S. Israel-Iran war, but it has really been felt across the region, right? And every single one of the Gulf Arab countries has been attacked as part of this conflict. And I do think that, there were already questions, and Dave, very interested in your thoughts here too. There were already questions about, the kind of, it's not just about the Gulf Arabs. A lot of our allies and partners around the world are questioning our commitment, and questioning the costs and benefits of their relationship with us. I'm not suggesting that they're going to start to kind of pivot away and kick us out and all of those things. I don't think we're there. But I certainly think that now you have the combination of a few things that is going to lead to some questions in the Gulf and elsewhere about the future of the relationship with the United States. One is this kind of big swing that we tend to do every 4 years, sometimes every 2 years in our policies, where, one day allies and partners are at the center of our national security strategy and, they're the cornerstone of our security. And the next we're trying to kind of, withdraw and to kind of take a step back from our international commitments. So there is this kind of inherent lack of reliability that I think, you're seeing. Added to that, the fact that there is now associated with hosting U.S. forces on your soil, if you're the Gulf Arabs, right? In some ways, having U.S. forces, assets, installations is supposed to be a deterrent. Here, it wasn't a deterrent. It was actually the opposite, where it actually provided the cover or the justification for attacks on Gulf Arab countries. So there is that element of it as well. I think we're seeing some interesting shifts as a result of this. Pointing to one example is the fact that the Gulf Arabs, I think, made the good step, although I wish they'd done it a few years before, of actually looking to a country like Ukraine that is making incredible leaps forward when it comes to battlefield innovation and kind of the use of cheap off-the-shelf technologies, as opposed to the big sophisticated platforms. And so now you're seeing more of that cooperation between the two sides. But it took this war for them to start to actually think about learning those lessons from Ukraine. And I'm glad, again, that they're starting to have that conversation, because I think, on some level, and I mentioned this in the case of the United States military as well, we are so reliant on these big sophisticated platforms that are just not, they're just not a good use of resources when the adversary, whether it's Russia or Iran, is shooting these cheap drones at you, right? So there needed to be some kind of rethinking, and I think that is a bit of a forcing function. But more fundamentally, I do think that if I were the Gulf Arabs, I would certainly be kind of looking at what the future of this relationship is going to look like, how to minimize costs for themselves and position themselves in a way to gain, leverage vis-a-vis Iran, but also minimize the potential of being dragged into future conflicts like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if they started to do that now.
Yeah, it's a real bind. I mean, we're at a historical inflection point, I think, where the large industrial nation at war, basically we've carried forward the World War II model, and what we've seen is that's actually become a little bit of a constraint. I mean, it's helpful for things like projecting large numbers of forces halfway around the world, but when you get into the tactical engagement, there's now a premium on innovation, and because we're so wedded to reproducing the USS Boxer, that we can't adapt to this, and then we're shocked when we realize that the Boxer can't get within 5 miles of shore because of 200 drones that cost $35,000 each. I guess we killed that point. So one of the things I'm looking at is the relationship between Iran and the GCC states. Things have changed. But the geography endures. Geography is like the Terminator. It doesn't feel sympathy or pity or regret or remorse. It can't be bargained with. Geography is geography. It's one of these unfair. It's like male pattern baldness. It's unfair. It happens to everybody, and it doesn't work in the way you want it to, but it does. So, what are those relationships going to look like in the future?
Again, I think this is a moment for the Gulf countries where I assume they're going to be taking a look at their standing. We've for years now across administrations we've been advocating for more integration. I guess I'll start by talking about what the intra-GCC piece of this, and then we can shift to Iran. I think another outcome of this conflict is, or it should be, is thinking more about that integration across the Gulf, because for so long it's been difficult across administrations to get the Gulf to kind of do more together absent the United States. And I think this war might be another one of those forcing functions that kind of brings those countries together, because they don't share sometimes they don't share objectives, they may not share some interests, but they share some threats, and there is a lot that unites them. And so, they should be doing more together here. But on the point of there are some interests and some I guess, objectives that they don't share. One of the things where they're sort of divided, have always been divided, is perceptions of Iran and how much of a, some have had more of a, the Saudi-Iran rivalry obviously is very different from the relationship that Iran has had with Oman, which has been largely positive, although that did not mean that, Iran still attacked Oman as well. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that this might actually push all of the countries in a direction where perhaps they're more unified now than they were a while ago. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I think you study this more closely than I do, but I do think that this is, again, a moment where they're going to have to kind of take a look at how do you reset this relationship? Where do you go from here? Yeah. And they may not have, this is, I assume, not the way that any of them expected or wanted this war to go, in terms of leaving a regime that is probably more emboldened, as I've said, more hardline, probably more inclined to acquire a nuclear weapon, and probably, in a very different, on a different track in terms of its relationship with the United States. If I were the Gulf Arabs, I would be kind of thinking about what that means, both in terms of the relationship with the United States, but also with Iran.
Yeah, honestly, I think the Gulf Arab states always had two nightmare scenarios. One is that we would poke the bear with the stick and then say, adios, we're out of here. And the second is the Libya scenario, where we just destroy it and leave a failed state that just emanates bad stuff, migrants, weapons, trafficking. Would you say we're closer to the former than the latter?
I think so. I think that's right. To put it bluntly, if you're going to do something like this, if you're going to go and spend this capital and capabilities and all of those things, you should probably have, well, number one, plans for what comes next, and also try to get to what comes next. Yeah. We've kind of done the worst, which is that we started this thing, got bored, and now we're kind of leaving it half finished, and we don't really know what comes next, and we don't seem to care. So to me, this was just the worst way of doing this.
Yeah, one of my criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, we're the Tom and Daisy Buchanan of foreign policy. We move in, we look beautiful, we have a great time, but we spread chaos and destruction all around us without knowing it, and sometimes and without any malign intent. It's just something that moves around with us. And so one of the things that is hard for people in the West to understand is the role of Iranian domestic politics and the impact of politics on foreign policy. And obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth. The regime has been able to position itself as a defender of the nation, but also has, defined at the outset anybody who protests against the regime as an enemy of justice on earth. So could you talk a little bit about how Iranian politics have evolved over the course of the conflict, and then how they're going to affect policy?
If I may, I'm going to take it even a little further back. That is the closeted historian in me, and kind of take us back to the 1980s very briefly. I won't go on too much about it. At the end of the 1980s, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war at the time, which really helped shape and cement the regime, right, throughout the 1980s, you had this period of consolidation, and that was accompanied by mass repression, thousands of people being killed, executed because they opposed the regime. And out of that came a supreme leader, the older Khamenei, who was obviously killed during the recent war, the current ongoing war, I guess I should say, who came out of that as, the supreme leader, succeeding the founder of the regime, and who really helped create the institutions that have since underpinned the regime that exists in its current form. And with that came the empowerment of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. What we're seeing with this conflict, there are a lot of parallels here, and it's too soon to know exactly where things are going to shake up. I suspect we'll see this, the current iterations, the IRI, Islamic Republic of Iran version 3, let's say, or 4, however you want to define it, we'll see that kind of consolidate over the next few months and years, and we'll have a better sense of what it's going to look like and how the war has shaped it. But a few things that we can already point to. One, the IRGC is even more embedded into the system, more empowered within the system. It is clearly playing a larger role on the political side of things now than it was before. It was already very present in military affairs and in economic affairs, and now it's taking that next step. And that was always part of the concern with what would come next in terms of succession. There was always a scenario in which the IRGC was going to be even more present in Iranian domestic politics, and I think we're seeing that play out a little bit. The second is that the current supreme leader, son of the previous supreme leader, is even less respected than he was domestically, and within even the regime power structure. He's even weaker than his father, who was quite weak early on in his tenure. It's probably not going to be obvious to folks who have only paid attention to the past few years of the regime, but he had a bit of a learning curve, and he had to really establish himself, which he did partially by empowering those other institutions. So the son is now going to have to do a lot of that work. But again, he does come in with the power and the backing of the IRGC as well. I mentioned previously, I think we're dealing with a much more hardline regime, one that is more inexperienced, but is that even less inclined to make concessions. And I think we're going to see that. And then the final thing, and this is a really important one that I think is getting kind of lost in all of the coverage of the war, is that this is now a much more repressive regime even than before. We just over the past couple of weeks, there have been human rights reports by Amnesty International and others that point to the repression that is being conducted. The executions are happening reportedly on a scale that we hadn't seen in a really long time. And we already saw that earlier in the year, right, with the protests that were shaking the country and the mass kind of, the massacre of thousands of people throughout the country. So you were already seeing that kind of movement. And I think a lot of that has been even more enhanced, I guess, accelerated by the ongoing war. So, you have a regime that was already feeling a little weak going into the conflict as a result of the domestic instability and the domestic opposition. Then you added the layer of the conflict, and now you have a regime that is going to come out of it, I think, much more entrenched in some of its worst impulses.
Well, what do you have upcoming at the Global Council? What should we look for? What excites you? This is your opportunity to put in a plug.
Well, a few things. In a couple of weeks, I will be hosting Richard Nephew and Daphne Rand for a conversation about Iran and what comes next. My attempt is really going to be to talk about, okay, we are where we are. None of us would have probably advocated for this conflict to go the way it is and for this deal to be what it is, but here we are. So where do we go from here? What does it look like for the Iranian people going forward? What does it look like for the region? And what does that mean for U.S. policy? So I'm excited about that. It's topical on this issue. And then the next thing, I mean, doing a lot of things on non-Middle East related things, but the next thing that is Middle East related that folks should keep an eye out for is that we will have our what's known as our annual survey of public sentiment toward U.S. foreign policy. And that is going to come out in the fall. And we're going to have a lot of questions about the Middle East, the Gulf, Israel, Iran, U.S. policy, vis-a-vis all of those things. So if folks are interested, they should keep an eye out for that. And we'll have some events and some publications coming based off of that, which I think will be very intriguing and interesting ahead of the midterms.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes, it will. So we've already mentioned Persepolis. What would you tell a young student trying to make sense of the chaos we have here, and Tom and Daisy Buchanan, I suppose? What would you, which is, guys, if you don't get the reference, look it up. You should.
Or read it. You read it.
Yeah, you're not old enough. You're not old enough. You know, if you're old enough to watch this podcast and you don't know who Tom and Daisy Buchanan are, you need to be shameful. What else should people read? Articles, books. I have my recommendations behind me. But what would you say?
Well, on the topic of Iran, a couple of books that I always have on my syllabus. One of them is, well, actually, let's start without a book. Let's start with a report. The Defense Intelligence Agency puts out a military power assessment, completely unclassified, made available publicly. They've done that for Russia, for China, for Iran. I would highly recommend folks who are interested in this topic to take a look. It's a very short report, very readable, and it does a really good job of it's not just about the military, although it does focus, obviously it's the Defense Intelligence Agency, so it does spend quite some time on the military piece, but it does a really good job of capturing the different drivers of the conflict and so on. It's a little dated now, but it's still very good. Second, Steve Ward had a great book on the Iranian military, whose title I think is Immortal, which I recommend folks also read. Again, it's been out for a while, but also a very, very good book. I've already mentioned Persepolis. If I may plug maybe a couple of movies in addition, let me plug the movie Separation. It's an Iranian movie. If we're staying on the topic of Iran, I'm happy to riff on other things too. A Separation, great movie. One of the things that I think is appreciated in Europe, not so much in the United States, is just how great Iranian cinema is. Yeah. Really fantastic universe of directors, and I should really give a shout out to the directors and the everyone who works in that industry in Iran, because they're under significant pressure, and within the constraints of the regime, they've been able to just produce some incredible moments in cinema history. So folks should really start with A Separation and then keep digging and see more of those movies.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Look, it's been really good, and we did bring you in here to talk about Iran. So, but it's great that we're able to cover all these things. And the point that I want to take away from this is, by studying culture, literature, film, art, you get sort of a bath in things, and you cannot disassociate the policy from the culture. And this is a problem we have, particularly in the United States, where we have a big bureaucracy and we switch people. In my career, I went from working NATO to Pakistan, and but getting that culture takes a while. I was the only guy I know who had played cricket competitively, so I guess I fit it. But it's something that if you really want to understand things, you can't just dive into policy. You'll miss things. One final recommendation: best French film. One. You can name one.
No, that's one. So unfair. Jeez.
Yes. Come on. One.
It might be the one that's behind me, Breathless.
Abu de Soufflé. Breathless. Yeah. Jean-Paul Belmondo, Gene Seberg. It's a classic. It pays homage to the early Poverty Row cinema in the United States. Okay, we'll give you that one. wouldn't be my choice, but this isn't about me, it's about you.
What's
so there
your
you go.
choice? I need to hear it.
Oh, Le Salaire de Peur, The Wages of Fear, by
It's a really good one,
Henri-Georges
too.
Clouzot. That one and Les Diaboliques, I think, are the
Yeah.
two most influential French films. They're both by Clouzot. Les Diaboliques is the movie that Alfred Hitchcock wanted to make Vertigo. Yeah, if you're into films at all, and they're both great. And The Wages of Fear was Yves Montagn's first film, so made him a star. Yeah, so there we have it. All right.
Those are great picks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, in this period of enmity where you have, I think I'm considered to be a right-wing American. Certainly, that's what my media career is based on. And you've been called all sorts of things that we won't produce here, but you're certainly. I haven't heard you called a right-wing American. At least
Maybe.
not.
Who's to say?
Yeah. Who's to say? Yeah, there's 6 billion people on the planet. They all have an opinion. But it's really wonderful to get the benefit of your expertise, your deep dive, not just on Iran, but the issues around Iran and American policy. We've been able to cover things that we think might be good, things that are not good, and how things are going to play out. All we know now is, though, Topic A is a document that none of us have seen, and the implementation of which, at least one of the terms, supposedly commits a country that did not take part in the negotiations to do something. So it's going to be a wild ride. Perhaps for the next few days, maybe the best answer will be to watch Iranian cinema or French cinema and then let the dust settle and then decide what you want to do. But until that time, on behalf of the Gulf International Forum, I want to thank Dr. Tabatabai for sharing her time, her wisdom, and her analysis with us. I want to thank all of you, the audience, for sticking with us. This is episode 3 of The Oasis, and we are working to define for ourselves a niche as an enjoyable, informative place to pass an hour or so of your time. And so until next week, I want to thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you back at The Oasis. Thank you.